So thank you everybody for coming. I see a lot of people, so I'm gonna get a bit anxious, I think. Anyway, thank you also for inviting me in this conference. Goran is there. It's gonna help me with everything that is needed. If you have questions, you can call him as well. So either during the exercises or for anything else related to the conference, I think you can count on him. Is that right? Thank you. So before starting, just one thing. There is a link in there. If you copy this link, you can access this presentation on Google Drive. And I suggest you to do so because we will see a lot of code examples, so probably it's going to be easier for you to just copy-paste things. Or even if you want to see another slide and go back and forward at your own speed, you can do that. It's also in the Slack channel in case you also join the Slack group. So I'm going to move on. So who is this guy? Hello everybody, I'm Luciano. I work as a principal application engineer, which is a fancy way of saying full stack developer at Planet 9 Energy, which is a company in the energy industry, specifically in the UK market for business to business. And we are building different products, but mostly for trading energy and for giving visibility to bills. We use a lot serverless, so it's not a topic today, but if you are interested in this stuff, you can talk with me later or in the following days. I'm also the founder of Full Stack Bulletin, which is a newsletter for full stack developers, which is as well open source and built on serverless technologies. So if you want to check it out, please do so and give me feedback. And finally, I'm also the author of this book, the co-author actually, called Node.js Design Patterns, which is a book focused, of course, in showing you how to implement some famous design patterns in Node.js, but also exploring some design patterns that are typical of the asynchronous architecture of the Node.js and JavaScript platform. And if you're interested, there is a little discount there in the corner. Okay, so what are we going to do today? I'm going to give you a quick introduction about what universal JavaScript is, what it really means, at least my view on what it means. Then during the day, we are going to build an application from scratch. So I'm going to give you a quick demo about this application. Then since we are going to use React and most of the workshop expects you to know React, I'm going to give you, probably it's going to be an half an hour, but really depends on how much you are confident with React. So we are going to try to learn React as quick as possible, at least the basics. And then I'm going to explain you how to set up a local development environment. And from there, we are going to move on building our real app. So what is universal JavaScript? Probably you heard the word isomorphic JavaScript. Well, if you heard that and you know what that is, it's basically the same thing. And if you don't know, universal JavaScript basically is the principle for which you can use JavaScript both on the front end and in the back end when you are building typically a web application. And the idea is that since you have the same language, which is JavaScript in Node.js and in the front end in the browser, basically universal JavaScript is a set of principles that allows you to do different things, like reusing most of the code in both the back end and the front end, and things like that. So the idea is, since we are using finally the same language in the back end and in the front end, let's try to make the development process a bit better. But it's not only for the web, and we are seeing that this paradigm to use JavaScript everywhere, not just to build front-end stuff on the browser, is happening in other environments. Like we saw for years now that people are trying to build even mobile applications with JavaScript. And they build the API with JavaScript. They build the front-end, so JavaScript is getting everywhere. Some people are even taking this paradigm into programming hardware, which I think it's a bit crazy, but just to show you that JavaScript is getting everywhere. What are the main advantages, at least on the web, for using universal JavaScript? My personal opinion is that the first big advantage is that you have a JavaScript-only development environment, which means that you don't have anymore the context switching, for example, between PHP on the backend and JavaScript on the frontend. And this probably will lead to a better maintainability of your code because everybody in your company will be used to that language. You will have standards, you will have modules that you can share across the different parts of your application. and less duplication of your code as well. But there is another advantage that is probably more important, and we will see later on better, which if you build a universal JavaScript application as opposed to a single page application, you will have better search engine optimization because the crawlers on the web will be able to see the content of your pages even if everything runs on JavaScript, and we will see how. And then there is another advantage, which is called faster perceived load time, which basically means that since we are rendering all the HTML from scratch at the beginning from the server, the browser has already everything in place when it starts to render the page. So it's going to be much faster in showing you something. There are other advantages. I'm not going to go into deep on this, but you have links in there in case you really want to know how much you can get from universal JavaScript. So you can check this one later on after this workshop. So which companies are using this paradigm already? Big names, right? We have Uber, Netflix, WordPress, Dropbox, Airbnb. So it seems that there is something that makes sense, right? If those big companies are encouraging this paradigm and they are using it. And actually they are building most of the tools that we use today to build universal JavaScript applications. Okay, seems very cool, but if you ever tried before this workshop to check online how to build a universal JavaScript, you will see that it's not that easy. And my goal today is to try to build something together so that you will understand the principles and then you will be confident to keep exploring until you get the setup that you really need for your application. And when I say that it's complicated, I say that for a reason, because there are a number of concerns that you need to address as soon as you need to build a universal JavaScript application. The first one is that you are going to start asking yourself, okay, I have this nice front-end application, single-page application, and I have some code on the backend, both in JavaScript. But sometimes I'm doing the same things in the front end and in the back end. Is there any way that allows me to share the code between the two parts? Because we know that JavaScript in the browser is not exactly the same JavaScript we have on the server. On the server you can read files, you can do more things that you cannot do in the browser, and in the browser maybe you can interact with Bluetooth and other things that maybe you cannot do on the server. So for solving this issue, there are things that are called module sharing or module bundler, and the most famous ones are Browserify and Webpack. Then the second issue is universal rendering. We say that a universal JavaScript application needs to render the HTML of your pages, either when you are already on the page and you click in a link and you just want to change something in the view, so the browser will need to know how to do that, or if you open a new page from scratch, there should be some HTML there based on the URL that you are requesting. So how can we do this rendering on both of the HTML code, basically on both the server and the client? And based on the framework or the technology you are using, there are different techniques. But most of the modern frameworks has a way to do that. Then there is another concern, universal routing, which is very similar to rendering, which basically means, okay, if I'm visiting /foo/bar, I should be able to get the right content, either if it's the first request I'm doing, so the server can give me the content, or if I was already somewhere in the page and I just clicked a link and I want the browser to give me only the new content. And then there is universal data retrieval. Most of the time you build application that needs data, right? You use API, you use databases. How do we get the same data on both the backend and the frontend? Then there is this other concept. If you already used React, you heard about Redux, or there are alternatives like Cerebral or MobX. And as soon as you start to do universal JavaScript with this, you have to be concerned, okay, how am I going to share the state between client side and server side? And again, if you want to use new stuff, fancy stuff like, I don't know, TypeScript, Elm, or ClojureScript, or Reason, that will make your setup even more complex. So yeah, that's why I say it's complicated, right? So many concerns that we have to take into account. But yeah, as I told you, my goal today is to build something together so that you start to remove all these barriers, and then you are confident that you can build a real application and solve all those issues in little steps. So do you have any question? I'm going to take just one question if you want about this part. Okay, great. So I'm going to show you what's the application we're going to build today. It is called Judo Heroes. I think I have a video here. Of course, it doesn't work, so I'm going to show it live. So this is the application we're going to build, which basically is a very simple application. You have just a list of items. In this case, are judo athletes. And if you click into one of them, you will see a detail page with all the medals of these athletes, and you can easily move to the other sections, and you can go back. So it's nothing really crazy. It's something that, I don't know, it's very similar to a to-do app or a blog app. So it's just to have something that you can relate it with most of the other applications you are probably going to build. And the thing that I want to show you is that I have two versions of this app. The first one is not universal. It's the one we are seeing right now. So if I do view page source, we are going to see just this little template code here, which basically doesn't mean anything. So if Google sees this content, they don't know what is in your page. So there is no way they are going to index your page for, I don't know, judo, for example. And if I go into another page here and I try to do the same, I will see exactly the same content. So as well, Google will not be able to tell the difference between the athlete page that I just clicked and the previous page, which was the index page. But I also have another implementation of this app that is universal, and this is the difference. Here, there is a lot of content that is coming directly from the server. So if I share this link with somebody, they will see a nice preview, and Google will be able to index this content. And as well, if I click into one of the pages and I try to look into the source again, I will see different content. It's going to be very hard to tell that it's different, but trust me on that. So you see, you have all the details about all the medals and the categories and stuff like that. So Google will be able to index this content properly. And there is another little detail, which is most of the time overlooked when building single pages application. So for example, I'm going to pretend I am an athlete, and I'm going to put my name in here. And of course, I'm not an athlete, at least not there. And what happens in a single page application when you do that is that, actually, I will show you here first. So if I do this, this is the version which is not universal. Let's put a random thing. So if I inspect the page and see the requests network, let's refresh. So you will see that this page is a 200 okay. It's not okay, right? This is a 404. And when you build single page applications, you cannot even do anything about that. When you make them universal, since you have control on the server, you can actually return the proper status codes. And this is very important for search engine optimizations, because if somebody starts to share URLs that doesn't exist in your platform, Google is going to believe that those things exist and that they have content which is probably your 404 page, and that is valid content. So you will get penalized by Google with that. Instead, when we do the same thing in the universal version of the application, if I do inspect and see the network, and then I refresh, we should see that the request is actually a 404 here. So this will be indexed correctly by Google. Okay? So that's the application we're going to build today. And this here you have everything that I explained you. So we can move on. So the tools that we are going to use today are Webpack, React Router, specifically version 4, and Express. Now I want to ask you, raise your hand if you have some level of experience with React. That's very good. So probably we will do the first part very quickly, because I created a number of exercises just to introduce you what React is, in case you don't know. So I'm going to try to go quickly, but if somebody doesn't know what I'm talking about, please stop me and make questions, so everybody will have the same level of knowledge after this part. Okay, so basically React, we are going to explore those things. It's way bigger. If you know React, there are a lot more concepts, but that's what we need for this application. So in React, everything is a component, which basically means that the view layer is built with a tree of components. And it's a bit like when you write HTML code and you start creating the tag called HTML, and everything lives inside that tag. We will see that React has a similar principle. And every component can be created in different ways. There are different syntax. We will see how. And a component can include other components. So a component can have children components. And components are very often defined in this language that is called JSX. We will see in a moment. They can receive data from the outside. And when we receive data in a component, we say that the data that is propagated is called props. And a component can also have a state. So if a component is doing something, like, I don't know, counting the time from the moment you open the page, it will need to have a counter inside the component itself in its state. And then it can be installed, or if you prefer, rendered in an HTML page. So you can introduce React even in an existing application and just have a little widget that is done in React, while everything else can be done in another technology. But most of the time you will have applications where you are rendering everything with React. Okay, now if you click in this link, I hope you have the presentation there, you will have the chance to enter in an editor online that allows you to test React stuff very easily. So you don't need to install anything in your machine yet, but you can just write React code and see the result in real time. Did you get the link? Cool. So the first thing I want to show you is how to create a component using the pure function syntax, which is my favorite way of creating component because it's very simple. You just need to write there basically what is a function that I'm calling I am a component, and then inside we are returning something that looks like an HTML code. We will see better what it means in a moment. And then when you create a component, you basically can say render this component with this syntax that looks like HTML inside this element here. So there is another way to define components, which is a bit more object-oriented. And basically, we have to say class, I am another component, extends something that is coming from React. Okay? And then inside, we have to provide this function called render, which basically returns the same thing that we had before. So this kind of HTML-like stuff. So there are differences between the two ways of doing things. With the pure function way, you can do limited things. With this way, you can integrate more features that are offered by React. But I prefer to go with the pure function one, just because it's easier most of the time to do things. And only when I need the extra feature, I will use this syntax here. So now the first exercise that I want you to do is just using the link that you had before. Try in literally 5 minutes to create an hello world component. So something that renders this hello world that you see there. Feel free to ask any question if you get stuck. I forgot to tell you that the link in there will give you a solution, so don't click it before you try yourself, okay? How many people already finished? Raise your hand, please. Okay, so I'm going to show you my solution really quickly, and then we will move on. So yeah, basically I'm using the syntax for pure function there. And I'm just saying, okay, return something that is inside an h1 tag, and it's saying hello world, and then I'm rendering this component, right? This should be very, very simple. So now the next step is to try to understand what that kind of HTML thing is. That thing is called JSX, which basically means something like JavaScript XML, I think. I'm not sure, but yeah. And basically it's a superset of JavaScript, which means that it's something that can be converted into JavaScript. So what you write like an HTML can be actually converted into JavaScript. And we will see how in a moment. Then there is another important aspect that it can contain expressions. So inside that HTML, you can use curly brackets to define expressions. So you can reference variables, you can reference attributes and other things that we will see that in a moment. And as I told you, can be converted to JavaScript, and it can include custom elements. And we will see that before we saw that I created a component called I am a component, and then I put that component inside another component, calling it I am a component as if it was a tag. So basically it means that you can combine what are regular HTML tags, generally they are lowercase, like a tag, I don't know, a link tag or div h1, with your own custom components that are called with uppercase letters, like, I don't know, hello world, or we will see in a moment other examples. And then there are some little differences. Because this is a superset of JavaScript and it gets converted to JavaScript, there are things we cannot do that we generally do in HTML. Like, for example, we cannot use the word class as an attribute, and we need to use class name because class is a reserved word in JavaScript. And properties that contains hyphens become camel case. So, for example, if we have CSS where we have background dash color, that becomes background uppercase color. Okay, this is the way that Babel can convert JSX code into JavaScript code. So on the left side, we see that there is a piece of what basically looks like HTML. So you can write this very easily. It takes just 5 lines of code, and it gets converted into actually 6 lines of code, and it gets converted into something that will be very hard to remember and even write because there are nested objects, a lot of parentheses. So you can see why this JSX thing, even if it looks strange for you, if it's the first time you are seeing it, it's very convenient to create components. Now, as I told you, inside JSX, we can use expressions. For example, there, I'm saying, inside my component, I want to show the current date. And you will see that gets rendered this way. Every time you render this component, you will get the current date. So with this syntax, basically, inside a piece of JSX, you can use curly brackets. You can add JavaScript expressions in there. Then, as I told you, components can contain other components. And most of the time, your application is nothing else than a component containing a tree of other components. So you will always have a parent component and then a number of children. And then the children can have other children and so on and so forth. So in this other example, I am creating 2 components. One that is called first child component, second child component. And then I have another component called parent component, which basically displays the title that is parent component and contains the first child component and the second child component. Okay, so basically this is showing you how you can create multiple components and combine them together. So in this other exercise, I'm going to ask you to, using the editor again, you can create a new project and create just 3 very simple components. One that is a title, one that is content, and one that is footer. And then you have to create a component called layout that basically combine all them together to create something like this. You have, I would say, other 5 minutes to do this. For those who know React, don't worry, it's going to get a bit more interesting later on. I hope. So again, I'm going to show you my solution very quickly, which basically is creating 3 different components. One is there, the second one is there, and the third one is there. And then another component called layout that basically just, as if they were tag, renders all of them in series, right? And then at the end, we just say, okay, our main component is layout, so we render that into the page. Sorry? Yeah, sure, sorry. Anyway, if you click in the link, you will access this page as well. You're welcome. Can you see it better now? Perfect. We can close this one as well, I guess. This one, right? Cool. Thank you. Okay, so I think that one was easy. Now, let's move into the next part, which is props. I already told you that props means something that basically defines the way we can pass data into components, right? So it's very similar to when you do HTML and you set attributes into a tag, which we are very used to do, I don't know, when we say style equal and you define a piece of CSS, or we say, I don't know, things about accessibility, we can use tag, or when we create an a tag for a link, we use href equals something. Okay, in React it's very similar. That's the way that allows you to pass data into components. And I created here a little example where we have this component called print props that basically received any prop that you want, and it's gonna print it as a JSON. So if we pass something like this, foo equal bar, bar equal buzz, and q equal q, it's gonna render the props like this. And when you create the component, you will receive the list of props as an object in the first parameter of your function. If you are using the other syntax, the class function, your render method will receive the props as well. So yeah, we can basically, with this principle, we can rebuild the example that we just saw before, and we can make the first, the child component, what we had before was called first child component and second child component as a single component that takes props, and it expects to have a props called name, and basically it will print as a title whatever you pass as a name. This then will allow us to use child component 2 times instead of creating 2 separate components, and we just need to pass different names. Also here I'm using a color. So I have another property called color, and I will set that property as a background in the style. Okay, so you will see here that you can combine all the elements that you receive as an input and use them to render your component. So another very quick exercise, this will take you literally 1 minute now, is to redo the hello world example, but this time you can accept a name and you will render hello, that name, instead of word, okay? And if you want to be fancy, you can also have a default. So if you are not passing any name, you can render your name or something else that you want. Okay. Just to give you my quick solution, I'm not gonna keep doing this all the time because I think you will get used to check it out yourself. So basically what I'm doing is just there I am accepting props, a set of props, and I'm using here the JavaScript destructuring with the default parameter, and then I'm saying hello name. Okay, if you wanted to use props, it would have been just props here and then props.name. Or you could have done also an if condition where if not props.name, then whatever word or whatever you prefer, otherwise use that value. Now, there is another important element. So React, as I told you, is all about creating components and composing those components together. So we saw easily how to create a component that contains other components and then how to pass data into those components, right? But there is another important feature that is called props.children. It's a special kind of prop that allows you to pass another element into an existing component that you have, and basically allows you to do things like that. So I create a component that is called center, and then another component that is called hello world, which is basically the component from before. And then I'm saying use center, but inside center, you see here, use the hello world component. So basically allow you to embed components into other components. In this case, I am creating a very generic component that allows me to center other components in the page, and I can use it to render any other component inside that. So every other component that I can use here will be centered in the page. Okay? So this is often called, this pattern is often called decorator components, because actually allows you to put something around an existing component. Now let's move into another topic. So if you had a list of things, like the two most difficult things in IT, which are naming things, cache invalidation, and off-by-one errors. I hope you catch the joke in there. Anyway, so if we have this list and we want to render the list in the page in a component, potentially this list can be, I don't know, 10,000 elements long, right? Of course, you cannot type 10,000 elements. And we know from programming very well that we have constructs to do that. Like we have loops, we have while, we have for, and things like that. Of course, we can use a very similar thing inside React Elements in order to render list of things. And the way you do that is basically you create an expression using the curly bracket there. You take the array and then you say dot map. And then inside the body of the map, which is a function, you render the element that needs to be repeated all the time, where you receive the current element in the array, right? So how many of you ever use the map method in functional programming with JavaScript? Most of you, perfect. So I don't need to explain what it means. Basically, you can reuse this map method because it returns another array as a result of this expression, and React will know how to render the resulting array of components. Now, another important element which I found out to be one of the most tricky things in React, and unexpectedly, is how to do conditional rendering. So I want to render something only if something else happens. I don't want to render it all the time. Or maybe I want to render something if something happens, otherwise I want to render something else, right? For example, in this case, we have this kind of application here, where we are saying, okay, you have some money, only if the balance is more than 0. Then we display the balance, and then if we have transactions, we show the latest transactions. So we have different components. First of all, we have this value money and latest transactions, which is an array. And then we have a component that can display those transactions. And this component is doing two things. So if data, which is the transactions that we get, dot length, so if not data dot length, it means that we don't have transactions. So in this case, we just return and we say no transactions available. So this will be rendered as no transactions available. Instead, if we have data, we can just say, okay, do the map that we just saw before and render all this transaction with amount and description. But there is another way to do if condition. So this one is when you have complex piece of logics, like when you have two different blocks of component and you need to render either one or another. But sometimes you can just use inline expressions. Like here, we want to render, you have some money or you have no money if the balance is 0 or less than 0. And basically, we can just do this inline by saying money measured in 0, then do some, otherwise do no. Okay? Now, I have another exercise for you, combining the two things that we saw before, so iterations and conditional rendering. So basically, you just need to list your favorite CSS colors and show them in the page some way like this. My advice is to create a component that allows you to display a single color. Then you can create an array of colors and create a component that iterates over that array and pass the data into the color component. And there is a bonus. If you use the color Rebecca Purple, then you should do something special, as you wish. I added a star. So that component should be able to know when you are passing Rebecca Purple and do something extra. We are a bit ahead of schedule, so I'm going to give you 10 minutes to do this. So let me know when you're finished, and if you have any question, tell me anytime. By the way, those are real CSS colors, okay? But you can put red, yellow. Also, if you prefer to check my solution first before trying to do it yourself, you can do that. Personally, I find better to try to do it myself and then look a solution. But feel free to do whatever is best for you. So I'm going to show you my solution so we can move on to the next part, which should be a bit more interesting. So basically what I'm doing, I had a list of colors before, which is just an array of strings where every string is the name of a color. And what I'm doing, I'm creating a component called color viewer, which basically renders just one of these elements that we cannot see anymore. And it's creating all the style using the color, so there, as a background. And then I am printing the color there, right? So that we can print this little box with inside the color that we want and its name. Also, I'm doing this in place if condition, where basically I'm saying if the color is equal to Rebecca Purple, then also add a star. Okay, otherwise don't add anything. And finally, in my app, I'm just using colors.map and creating the color viewer component, passing the current color. Okay, any question? Okay, now I had a nice clarification from this guy, which I don't remember the name. Thank you. So he pointed out a very important feature of React, mostly for performance, that I didn't want to explain, but probably it's good if I tell you very quickly. So basically, when you create an iteration over an array and you render a number of elements, you should be using something called a prop called key, equal, and a value. And that value needs to be unique to the element you are rendering. For example, if you are rendering over, I don't know, an array that is coming from a database, you will probably use the ID of every record there. And this is because the way React works, it creates like every time you re-render your components, it has a diff algorithm that is very fast. It's called virtual tree or virtual DOM, and allows to just render the things that changed. So if you use the key, it will be very easy for React and very fast to determine if that specific line changed or not. So if it needs to be re-rendered or not. And re-render means removing the line from the DOM and attaching a new line. So it's very important that, especially if you have big lists, that you use this property. And actually React is going to give you a warning if you're using the development mode in the console every time you do a loop without using the key property. And then there is another little optimization, which is this one, which basically here I could just pass null, and it's going to be slightly more performant because it's not going to create a virtual DOM element when we use null. So in this case, we don't want to render anything, so it's pointless to create a DOM element just to render an empty string. Now, there is another example which I'm going to show you very, very quickly because we don't really need this for our exercise, but I think it's important to understand all the basics of React. So the last thing that I want to show you is how to do things that react to action of the user. In this case, I have this component here, which is just a box saying click me, and every time you click it, the background changes randomly, okay? I don't know if you can read this code. Is it too small? Maybe you can check it on your slide, but basically the idea is that I'm going to show you the important part directly in the example. So basically every time I click, I get a new different random background color. But the important part is that we can use this prop here called onClick and associate a function that gets executed every time that this event happens. In this case, I'm using the class component, so I can create the change color function inside the class itself, and then I have to reference it with this.changeColor.bind. And basically, inside change color, what I'm doing, I'm just creating a new random color using this RND function, and then I use this other function called setState. And I pass color to set state. Now, I'm not going to explain you in detail how the state works, but basically the idea that I want to give you is that every time you have to create a component that reacts to specific action from the user, you need to do binding to the specific action with things like that, on click. And you can find a list of all the actions that are supported in the React website. And then the other important thing is that every time you need to hold an internal state for that component, for example, in this case, there is a color that changes every time, and this is part of the state of my component. That thing goes into something that is called state. And the way you change the state is just saying this dot set state, and you specify the new state. And there is also another important part that is how do you initialize the state. So when you create a component with the class syntax, then you can just use the constructor, and inside the constructor you can define the initial state. And in this case, I'm doing this. So I can also pass a start color that is always going to be the same. And then every time I click, I will get a new random color. So this is just for completeness, but we don't really need to use this feature in the rest of our exercises. Okay, so just to recap before we move on into the next bit, what we learned with React is that everything is a component. And if you click in there, you will go to the documentation of React where you have all the components explained in detail. Then the ideal way to create React applications is to basically compose components instead of creating inheritance. So you will never extend one component from another component. You only extend from the base component of React, but then every time you need to reuse something from that component, either you include the component into another component, or you pass it as a children inside an existing component. But you will never try to extend things in React. Then another important aspect is that you pass the data through props, and usually you will find that people say that the data flows down, which means that you will have the data at some point in the top, and this data will be propagated to the children elements. And also the internal data is something that is called state. So if a component needs to have and manage internal data that changes over time, that's called state. And then components can react to events. Okay. We are in time. So the next step is to set up a local environment so that we can develop things in our machine instead of keep using the tool online. So that we can also later on do the server-side part, which we cannot do online. I have here two options. So if you have already Node installed and you prefer not to use the VM, you can do that way. Otherwise, in the VM, you should have already Node installed, and you should be able to do the rest of the things inside the VM. Okay? Let me know in this step if you have any issue, because otherwise you will not be able to progress with the rest of the things. So stop me anytime that something is not working for you. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is to create a folder somewhere. I'm calling it judo -heroes-2. You can call it whatever you want. And then inside this folder, we need to do npm init-y. Of course, if you don't want to type, you can also copy-paste from the slides. Okay, the next step that I'm sure you don't want to type manually is to install all the dependencies. So I hope the connection works. If it doesn't work, I have some files that I can share with you with a pen drive, or you can download. If it's too slow, I can tell you where to download a zip file that contains already all these dependencies. But of course, I don't expect you to type this stuff, just copy-paste from the slides. Okay, I'm going to show you the other, I think I have here. I don't know if you are already in this group. So there are two links in there. One is the one for the slides, in case you didn't get it yet, which is this one. And the other one, it contains all the files that we will need later on. So in case your connection is not working or is too slow, if it's not working, of course, you will not be able to do this, but I can give you the file in a pen drive. Or it should be in the VM, but I'm not sure if it's the last version. So it's better if you ask me in case you cannot get this file from there. So were you able to get it working, to get all the dependencies and the slides and everything else? Somebody still have problems? Okay, so I'm going to show you two things and then I'm going to make, actually I'm going to give you a pen drive first so you can start to copy all the files that we will need. Is somebody else having problems with getting the files? No? Great. Okay, I'm gonna move on from here. So the next step is to create all the folders. So basically in our application, we will organize things this way. It's not necessarily the best way to organize things in React apps, but I think it's simple enough for our use case. So we will have a folder called source, where we will put all our source files. And then inside this folder, we will have a folder called components, one called data, one called views. And then outside the source folder, we will have a folder called static for every static resource we will need, like CSS and images. Okay, so now the next step is to configure Babel. Just to repeat, Babel is the tool that allows us to convert all the React syntax, including JSX, into JavaScript code that can be executed in any browser. And this file basically is telling Babel, which is a generic tool that can transpile different languages and different features of JavaScript, is saying, okay, I want to use in my project React, NES 2015. ES 2015 is basically the extension of JavaScript that adds new things in the syntax, like, I don't know, the structuring or default parameters and other things like the class syntax, things that we are using that by default they don't work in every browser. So we need to transpile them into a version that can be run in every browser. So this file is called .babelrc and needs to be in the main folder of our application and needs to contain this little JSON object. Then the next step is to configure Webpack. Webpack is our module bundler. And the role of Webpack is just to create a single file that contains all our application. So Webpack will be able to understand what's inside our code, read all the references between files, and then combine everything together and do a lot of other optimization. And Webpack will also use to invoke Babel. So it's going to do different things, but at the end, it's going to give us something that we can run in our browser. So just to understand this syntax, there are three different parts. One is called entry point, which we define with entry. And entry point is basically the file that is our main file. From that file, Webpack will start to search for all the references and combine everything together. And in our case, our main file will be app-client.js inside source. Then output defines where do we want to save the resulting file. And finally, module and rules, it's something that allows us to interpret files. For example, here we are saying everything that is inside source needs to be considered as something that I can run with Babel. So this will use the Babel config to compile React stuff into executable JavaScript. And then there is another thing that we can do with Webpack, which is called hot module reload. So when we were using the tool online, it was very nice, a very nice user experience, because we were able to change something and seeing immediately the change in the page. So if we did something wrong, it was very easy to spot, and we don't need to spend time in rebuilding and refreshing the page. Everything was happening automatically. We can get the same experience with this feature of Webpack. And to do that, we need to change the configuration a bit. So we need to add Webpack on top, and then we need to add those two files in the entry, and then this part here. And finally, the plugin here at the end. Basically, this will make so that every time, so we will run our application through the Webpack server, which is a sort of HTTP server, like an Express server. And this server will be able to, every time that there is a change in the files managed by Webpack, refresh your browser. So, and it's going to refresh only the parts that are changed. Now, the next step is to create an index file, because of course we need to serve our application to a browser. So we need to have an HTML file that links to the file, to the JavaScript file that executes our React application. So you can just copy paste this into static/index.html. But the only important thing is that here we are referencing the output file coming from Webpack. And as well, another detail is that there is a CSS here, and I will tell you in a moment how to get that. Okay, so now, in case you didn't get the link before, where you had all the data files and static files, there is this other link there where you have only the static files. So if you didn't have images and CSS, you can get them from there. And then you just need to unzip the file and copy CSS and image inside the folders that you have in your project. And you need to do the same for the data file, which is in this link here, and needs to be copied inside source data. So the previous link is here, is JHW as Judo Heroes Workshop -static. And then the other one is JHW-data. I promise this is one of the last steps. We are almost done. Okay, now the last thing before we can try our local setup is to create the app client file that we had in our Webpack config. And we can just put a simple Hello World application in there for now. And then we will see if it's going to be rendered fine in our local setup. Okay, now assuming that we did everything right, you should be able to run this command here. And this will start a web server at this address, where you should see something like this. And if you want to test that the hot module reload feature is working, you can just change the code in app client to render something else. And you should see that even without refreshing the browser, you will see things changed in the page. And that should be your feeling if everything worked well. So I was expecting here to go for coffee break, but we still have some time, so I'm going to make sure that everybody has the local setup running, okay? So, okay, so in the next part, let's say that we finally have this development environment ready, right? So we can build stuff in React in our machine. Every time we change something, it's going to refresh the page. Okay, now we can finally build our application, all the components that are needed in our application. Here I am proposing a structure, okay? You know exactly what's the goal because I showed you the application. So this is my idea for the components that are needed to build this application. So the first one is a layout component, which is a top-level component that basically gives you an header, a footer, and then an empty space in between where you can pass another component as a children. And we will use this thing to render all the pages in our application. So the top-level component is a layout, and then we have different page components. So the first one is called index page, and it contains everything that goes in the main page. The second one is called athlete page, and contains everything that describes the page of an athlete. And then we also have the not found page. So two different levels, layout and page level. And then we have a third level that is like utilities component, that are smaller piece of components that you will use in every page. So one is this athlete card, which basically is just a preview of an athlete in the index. Then we have athlete menu, which is the menu in the athlete page. And then we have flag, which is just a little utility that allows us to render a flag and the name of the flag. And then we have medal, which is just an helper that allows us to render all the details of a medal. So if it's bronze, silver, or gold, the year, the place, the kind of championship, and the category. Now, we can do two things. So I'm going to ask you to vote. The first one is that we do this together. So I'm going to show you all the code and we try to implement it together. Or I can give you this to you as an exercise. So probably you can experiment and try to build the components yourself. But basically, here you will have all the code for every component. So who prefers to do it together? Raise your hand. Wow, okay, so let's do it yourself as an exercise. So you have all the slides. Meanwhile, I'm going to put you there what I expect you to have at the end of this exercise. Actually, let me see what's the time I expect you to finish. There. Okay, so you should have about, let's say, 15 minutes. And if you cannot get it done in 15 minutes, you can just copy and paste the files, okay? Meanwhile, I will go around, so if you have any questions on the implementation, you can ask me. Or if you want to implement things in a different way, feel free to do that, and we can compare it. So just to give you a little advice. So at this stage, we are going to create different components, but those components, they are not shown anywhere, right? Because in our app client, which is our starting point, we are just rendering hello world. So what I can suggest you to do is that every time you build a new component, you just import it in the app client and you render it somewhere. So while you keep working on that, you will see, for example, I implemented first the flag component. Then I added it in the app client so that I can see it's working properly as I expect. Then I implemented the medal component and I added it like that. Then the menu, then all the other components, okay? So meanwhile, while we build the components, we can see if they look as we expect. Or if you have any error. And also in the slides, I'm giving you an example on how you can use that component with which parameters. So meanwhile, I'm going to go very quickly through all the components just to quickly check the code and stop me if you have questions. So the first one is the flag component, which displays just the flag, as we saw here. Oop, doesn't work. Come on, here. So basically what we are doing here, we are accepting these props as input. So the name of the country, the icon, which is a reference to the file name, and then an option that is a Boolean that allows us to choose if we want to display the name or not. So I'm making this component a bit more complex than it should be. So I'm giving it a lot of options. But just to show you that it's good to have components, because then you can include all the logic that you want in that component. So if you will ever need to use only the flag without the name, this component can do that as well. Or if you want to use, I don't know, a reference to another country, you can just specify options, okay? So here what I'm doing, I'm just returning an image that contains title, source, and alt taken from these props. And then basically I'm checking if you want to display the name, then I'm gonna also add a span that contains the props.name. So this is the simplest component. And then you are supposed to use it this way. Of course, this is just an instance. In reality, here you will pass data coming from the above components. Okay? So in reality, here you will have something like, for this specific athlete, give me the flag, and then here you will pass flag.name, flag.icon, flag.showName, maybe will be always true. Then the second component is the medal component, which basically is this one. Oh, sorry. This one. So we expect it to be rendered in a list, and then it should display a little badge that represents the medal color, so bronze, silver, or gold, then the year, then the place where it was the competition, the name of the competition, and the category. So basically what we are doing here is just supporting all these options as props. So all these things, you can pass them as input. And we have this convention where G, S, B are shortcuts for gold, silver, and bronze, like a lookup table. And as well, this is more than we really need. You can build this component in many other different ways. The only important thing is that at the end, this component should display year, city, event, and category. And the medal, you can make it as complex as you want. Then the next component is the menu. You remember the menu in the athlete page. And basically what I'm doing is I am assuming that you will get a list of athletes coming from this file. Okay? You can open this file if you're curious. It's going to be a big JSON with all the data that we will use in our application. An array actually of athletes. Every athlete is an object, and you have his name, the medals, and all the details that you see in the application. And basically what I'm doing, I say, okay, assuming that I have this list and I get it in my component as a prop, what I want to do is just going through the list of athletes. So I'm doing athletes.map. And then for every athlete, I'm rendering this athlete menu link component. And this menu component basically is just rendering a link, so an A tag, that reference to the expected URL for that athlete. Okay? We will see exactly later on how do we do the routing, but for now I'm just assuming that the page for that athlete will be /athlete/his name. Actually his ID, which is like his name in a ID version. And then I also created this little helper just to make the menu shorter and not displaying the full name, like name, surname, and just displaying the first letter of the name and then a dot and then the surname. So just to give you an idea, it will look like this. So I'm not displaying the full name of this guy, I'm just displaying the first letter of the name, then surname. So we have all these utilities. You can make these things as much complex as you want, of course, based on your use cases. Then the next one is athlete card, which is this component here. So a single athlete in the index page. So you see that in this component here, we have a lot of things. We have an image, we have the name, we have here a counter of the medals. So this is going to be a little bit complex because here we want to display So the image with the profile, then we have the name, and then we have the medals count, which contains a little icon for the, like a little medal PNG icon, and then the number of medals. And then another interesting thing, this is in React, this specific syntax, ... athlete 0, means that all the properties that are available in this object, so the key values properties for every athlete, are passed in this component as props. So if we have here something like name equal something, is going to be passed here. If we have, for example, props name, then we will have props medals, and you will have also medals there. Then the next one is the index page, very similar to the menu page, but this time we are just rendering the cards instead of the menu items. Okay, because in the index we just had a list of cards like this. So we go through all the athletes, and for every athlete we just render it, okay, one after the other. And finally we have the athlete page, which is the most complex. I'm not even going to explain it to you, because it's just a combination of all the previous one. It includes medals, it includes flags, it includes all the other informations, but it's just at the end markup. So in your own time, if you want to spend some time in trying to figure out how did I build it, you can do it. But there are 100 different ways or more to build the same thing. And finally, the 404 page, which is just plain markup with a link to go back to the main page. And the layout is probably interesting to see, because we want to use the layout this way. Do you remember when we described the decorator components? So a component that can contain another component or other components in general. And we use props.children to render whatever is the component inside. So we can use the layout this way. In reality, we will use it either with an index page, with a not found page, or with an athlete page inside. Okay? So the only important thing here to remember is this props.children to render whatever is passed inside. And before doing this, I'm going to show you again. Actually, no, we can move on, I think. So yeah, now the question is, we have all these components, right? But in itself, they don't mean anything. We can render them on the page, but they don't create our application. In order to have an application where we can click and move into the different section, we need to have routing. So we are going to use React Router, and I'm going to give you a very brief introduction on how it works. So we are going to use version 4. Did somebody ever use the previous versions? And version 4? Never? Okay, that's good, because it's going to be totally different. So the main difference is this one, dynamic routing, which means that basically you can have different routes inside components, and it's like having a smart if statement, right? That says basically, if I'm matching a specific route, I'm going to render what's inside this route condition. So that means that you can have routes that gets rendered in different places and in different moments of the application lifecycle. While in the previous version of React, you only had routes in a single place at the top level, and you basically were just choosing, I want to render this component or this other component or this other component. Now with the new version, you can render multiple things with multiple conditions at the same time. But we will see it in a moment why it's useful. Then we will do universal routing. So the thing of React Router 4 is that it's for some reasons easier to do universal routing, and we will see how we can do it. And then there are some advanced features that we will not cover but are interesting to know. Like you can do nested routes, or you can do responsive routes. Basically you can say things, I don't know, if you are on a mobile, these routes will work, but if you are on a desktop, I'm not even considering this route. For example, if you are building a mail client, maybe, I don't know, in a mobile phone, you would like to have only the list of emails, and then if you click, you see the content. But maybe in a desktop, you want to have the list, and then the selected item will show the content already on the side. So you can do all these sorts of things with React Router 4. So how it does look like? So basically, we need to import a few things. Browser router as a router, and then route and link, from this package here, React Router DOM. And then in our application, we need to do something like, okay, I'm gonna wrap everything with router. So it's a decorator component. And then inside this router, you can have route components. And they say, when the path is matching this, so just slash, then I want you to render the component home. When the path is matching pages, page 1, I want you to render page 1. When the path is matching page 2, then I want you to render component page 2. So in this specific application, we have 3 links, and they change the route into slash or slash pages 1, pages 2, and it will change the content here based on this routing. One detail to know is that the matching of the path is just the beginning of the string. So if we don't specify here exact, it's going to match everything. So this path here is going to match even slash X, Y, and Z. By saying exact, we are saying it needs to match exactly this route. But we are not saying this here. So this will match also page 1 slash something, page 2 slash something. Okay, and this is because it will allow us to do nested routes. So we can also use another syntax, because here the issue is that we needed to create a component called page 1, a component called page 2, another component called home, just because here we are basically passing the class of the component, right? We are not creating an instance. It will create the instance for us. If we want to instantiate the instance by passing specific options, we need to use the render method. So in this case, I have a generic component called page that accepts a name. And I can use render to say, okay, every time this thing is matched, to render something inside this component here, you need to use this function, which basically returns a page with on page. In the other case, we return a page with page 1 and page 2. So now we are using a single generic component, and the render function will allow us to construct the specific instance. Then another important feature is that what if we want to render only the first matching route? Because I told you that this is dynamic, right? So if I remove here exact, it's going to render this one. But if we are in pages, page 1, it's going to render this one and this one. So we will see 2 blocks. We will see on page and also page 1. What if we don't want that? So we could match different routes, but we want to display only the first one matching. So in this case, we have to use this switch. And switch is going to make sure that the first route that is matched here will render and not the other ones. And this basically allows us to explicitly say, so the last route, which is a generic one and not even specifying the path, is going to be a not found. So basically, if this doesn't render, this doesn't render, this doesn't render, it will always render this one. Okay? So this allows us to have a not found route or any other generic routing system that for which you want to display a route only if it's the first one or the last one matching. And now the last thing that we need to know about React Router. So you noticed here that we had page 1 and page 2, which basically are the same thing, right? What if we could have a generic variable here called, I don't know, ID, and then we have here a generic method that allows us to select the page from the ID. Of course, we can do that. And it's going to look like this. So we can specify column ID or column something else. I'm just giving here the ID, but every parameter needs to have column. And then in the render function, we will get props.match as a parameter, and we can use match.params.id to get the content that is specified here. So basically here, when we are in page 2, we will render page 2, which is the ID of the page. Okay? In our application, of course, when we visit an athlete page, we get the ID of the athlete, and then we can select the data from our array of data based on this process here. Now we have a very nice exercise where you have to build a blog. Very simple one, of course. I don't expect you to build WordPress right now. And the thing is that I expect you to have 2 routes. One that is an home page where you just list all the posts. And then when you click in the title of one post, you will go to this link post and post ID, and it will display the content of the post and a link to get back to the home page. Okay, how much time do we have? Actually 5 minutes, so probably it's easier if you just check my code, and then if you have any question, we can review that. Or if you prefer, I can give you 10 minutes, and then should be a bit faster in the next part. What do you prefer? Try to do it yourself or not? Okay, so just read the code, these 5 minutes, and then I will explain it to you very quickly and move on. The code which is there. Just in case you want to try this even later, or tomorrow or another day, you can do all these things in the React sandbox that we saw before, this code sandbox.io. The only thing you need to be aware is, since this one is another dependency that is not included by default, you need to add it from there, okay? So if you want to do this exercise or other related exercises in this website, you need to add the dependency in order to have the React router DOM. In case you didn't catch the joke, this is the blog of Bender from Futurama. So just to show you the application working. So this is the home page. So we have 3 posts, and we can click in one, and it's going to render that post. So you can go back, click another one, and it's going to render that, and so on, right? The things that you have to notice, which you cannot see here, is that if I click here, we have /post/1. I can even change it here and say 2, and it's going to render another post, right? And I can go back at any time. I can go to post 3 and change it again to post 1, and it's going to refresh everything, but it's going to render the right post. So what is going to happen here, since at this stage we don't have any universal feature, right? So when we click and refresh the page and we say, I don't know, /post/3, what happens is that the index page is always loaded. And then when the index page is initialized and the JavaScript is executed in the browser, React router kicks in and checks which component needs to be rendered based on the current path, okay? So what is happening in this IDE online is that they always render the index page, and then everything else is happening inside the JavaScript part. When we will make it universal, we cannot use this thing anymore because we will need to do things from the server side based on the current URL. So now, just to see how I'm building this. Of course, there are different ways to build this. This is just my implementation. So first of all, I created a file called posts.json that contains all the posts. And for every post, we have an ID, a title, content, author, and published at. You can make it as fancy as you want. You can add tags. You can add anything that you want, okay? Maybe you can build the next WordPress like this. Then there is this index file that contains everything else. So we are importing browser router, route, link, and switch components from React router. And then we are creating 2 components. The first one is a layout that just includes the title of the page and creates a slot for rendering the different pages. So either the index page or the post, the single post page. So the index page, I call it posts list, and basically gets a list of posts and render this specific thing for every post. Okay? So the title with a link published by the author on a specific day. And then I created the post page, which is the one you get when you click in here, which basically contains the title, the content of the post, and then a link to get back. So this is very simple. Now, how do we bring everything together using the React router? So I told you that we have to use router, first of all, as first component. Then we want to use a layout. So inside the router, layout is the first thing we put. And then we have to use switch because we want to render only one thing at a time, only the first thing that is matching our rules. So if we are in slash here, the home page, we want to render the list of posts by specifying our array of posts. Instead, if we are in slash post slash parameter ID, which is going to match /1, /2, /3, and so on and so forth, then we want to get the specific post from our list. So I'm taking here match.params.id, and I also do -1 because my posts coming from a JSON array are 0 based, okay? And then I pass this value into the post. And then if this route is not matching, I will just render post not found. So if I'm gonna write here something like xxxx, it should render post not found, okay? There is a little detail here that you might have noticed. What if this post here doesn't exist in the array? So what if I'm passing, I don't know, /22? Of course, it's not gonna work because I didn't manage this case, right? But you can make it smarter and just start to add there a little block of code saying if the post exists, do that, otherwise render not found as well. And that's what we are gonna do in our application. Any questions on this? Is it clear? Cool. So we are 5 minutes late. Okay, so going back to our application, we want to do, we have all the components now in our application, and we want to define the routing there. And it's very similar to our blog example as we just saw. So we want that in the slash, so the main route, we render the index page. Then in the route athlete/ID, we render the athlete page for that specific user. And then everything else will be a not found page, right? So this is very, very similar to what we did in the blog example that we just saw. So we need to define a component that we can call just app.js. So this is a new component, right? We are creating the component that brings everything together. We had all the bits and pieces before. Now we are creating the glue between them. And we are going to call it app because it's actually the core of our application. So we import all the components that we just created: layout, index page, athlete page, and not found page. We don't need to import the other ones because they will be imported by the specific pages that uses them. And then we also import our data, okay? In a real-world application, this can be done with an API call, but for now, it's just way easier to take them as a file, as if you had everything already in place there. And then we are defining a couple of functions. The first one allows us to render the index, basically specifying, okay, the index is the index page with an array of athletes. And the render athlete is instead the function that will render the specific athlete page. Here, I'm actually managing the issue that I described before, right? Because it might happen that somebody's telling me, I want to see the page athlete/Luciano. Luciano doesn't exist as an athlete, so what I'm gonna do? I can manage this because I can check, okay, if I can find the athlete with this ID in my array, then I'm gonna use it. Otherwise, I'm just gonna return not found page. Okay? If I don't get into this if, it means I found the athlete, and then I can just return the athlete page with the specific parameters. Okay? Here it's a bit confusing that we have two parameters, one called athlete and one athletes, right? It's just because we want to have the list of athletes because we are rendering the menu inside our page. So we need to know all the athletes in the menu. And as well, we need to have a selected athlete, which is going to be this one here. Okay, you can implement this in different ways. This is just a simple way to do it, but it might look a bit confusing at first time. So finally, then we can render our app saying, okay, we want to use the layout. Inside the layout, we want to select the first route that is matching here. And we have, if we slash, we render index. We just render the main page. If it's this one, athlete ID, then I want to use this function here. And then everything else we render a not found page. Another thing to notice is that not found page is here to handle the specific case when this is not existing. And it's also here when you specify any other URL, okay? It's the same when you do, I don't know, an API, and you have, I don't know, if you are building an API that returns different superheroes, let's say. You will have superhero / an ID, but somebody else can call your API by saying, instead of superheroes, I don't know, banana, which is not a valid URL. So you will need to manage the 404 for unexisting routes or for existing routes with unexisting data. Okay, finally we can update our app client.js, which before was just displaying an hello world. And this is our entry point for the browser. And what we need to update is just to use the app component that we just created and insert it into a router component. Because we just said before that the routes here only works when they are inside a route component. So you can imagine that if we put app inside a router, then it's like if we are decorating all of this with a router outside. So here and here, okay? So basically we are saying this app will use a router. And why this is needed? Because of course the router is what connects the browser URL to the rest of the application. Okay, so router is actually the piece of logic that knows how to get the URL from the browser. So that's why it's called browser router. And then finally we can say, okay, when the application is loaded, render this component. And it's gonna automatically get the URL from the browser. Cool, let's test it. Okay, so the first time we open the application, we are in the main path, so we see the index page, that's good. Then we click and we see the athlete page, that's good. Then, I don't know, we can click here and we can go back to another athlete, so we can explore as much as we want. And then we can also go back and go back to the index, okay? Apparently, everything is working as we expect. Apparently. I don't know if you noticed that there was a little flickering while I was clicking in every link. And that's because every time I'm clicking at this stage, the page is refreshed, which totally invalidates the point why we are using React, right? So we are using React to build single page applications, so why I am refreshing all the time? And that's because when you use React Router, you cannot use just plain a tag, but you need to use this special component called link. So just to clarify better, here, that's what we are currently doing. So we are saying, okay, every time there is a card, I can click on it and it should bring me there, right? That's what you will do in a normal HTML piece of code. But in reality, when we use the React Router, we need to use this component link. And the format is that you use link, and instead of href, you use to. And to is going to be a URL, okay? Why we need to do that? Because there should be some piece of logic. So if we do this, the browser doesn't know what to do with an A tag, right? You just click and it's going to behave like any other A tag. So refreshing the page and going into that specific URL. When we do this, this component here has a specific internal click handler that will make sure that you don't refresh the page, but you just load the new content based on the routing logic. Okay? So, based on this, we will need to change everything. So, search and replace all our components and change here. Oh, of course, I need to import as well the link component, which is coming from the React Router DOM package. And we need to change every link in all our components with this syntax. You don't need to do it now, okay? So, I want to show you the next step, and then I'm going to give you a bit of time if you want to do all the changes. Okay, again, now if everything works correctly, you shouldn't see the flickering, right? I click here and the content is immediately shown. Okay, you see it's very fluid because I'm changing only this part here and not refreshing the full page. But if you don't believe me, which is possible, so I can do inspect, I can show you the request, where is it? Network. So the first time that I load it, let's close this one, I have the HTML page, which is here, and then CSS and everything else, right? Then the next time that I click something, I just get 3 new files, okay? So I'm not refreshing the full page, I'm just getting the new stuff that is needed, which are just images. And again, if I go back to the home page, I'm just getting few new images that are needed. So all the previews of the athletes that we didn't check before, and this little icon here. But I'm not getting any other HTML page. To see this more clearly, we should have here something like documents, doc. Yeah. So still, after navigating a while, we only loaded one document, which was the first athlete that we were checking, okay? But now I'm gonna show you something. This one here, I don't know if you noticed that before we didn't have the selected menu voice, right? Now I also added the selected menu voice. So let's check it out. So in order to make a component selected based on the route, this is one of the new features of React Router 4. Basically, we are rendering this little component here inside a route as well. Okay? And we are saying, so we are adding logic to say, every time this is being rendered, since the result of this rendering depends on the current route, then we need to use the route here, right? So if you create a route element and inside you specify this function with this specific format, inside match, you will have a Boolean value that will tell you, I am rendering something that is matching or not. And then here you can decide what to do with that. In this case, I'm just saying, if it's currently matching this one, this URL here, then I'm gonna mark it as active, otherwise I will not do that. Okay, but you can use this to do more complex stuff. So every time you have something that you want to render based or not on the current route, then you can use this approach. Cool. So how much time do we have? So we have about 5-10 minutes in case you want to copy all those changes here into your app. And also if you want to have these 2 files there. So the app file and the app client file. Meanwhile, if you have any question. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to explain it again. So the question is, it's not very clear how this thing works. Okay, so the way React Router works is that you have this route object. Actually, you have a router object that is wrapping everything, the full application. And then inside the application, you can have at different levels, multiple times, route objects. And every route object needs to have a path, right? Everything that is inside is going to be rendered if and only if this thing is matching by default. And we were saying before, either render or component equals something. I don't know if I have an example here. Yeah, here. So before we had route and path and then render function, right? This function was getting executed only if we were matching this path, okay? This is a slightly different use case, right? Because in this case, we are not even saying render or component. We are just passing inside a function. So this is more like if you want to override the default logic to render. And you can do that by passing a function that will get a Boolean value, which will be true or false, based on the fact that this route here is matched or not. So if you are in page /1, and here you have page /1, in this match you will have true, otherwise you will have false. And then here you can return whatever you want, but you will be able to use this true false to do different things. So in this case, I am just adding a class, just to render this in a different way, only if this match is true, otherwise I'm not even adding a class. Okay, I could have done something like color equal red if this is matched, otherwise equal blue. Okay? Clear now? Great. Any other question? So the next step will be to add universal rendering and routing, because at this stage our application is only running in the front end. Every time I refresh, everything is recalculated and the server is not returning all the HTML code that is needed for that page. So just to show you what I mean when I say that this is not universal yet, here we have this template without any detail about this page. And if I go to the main page and I refresh, again I have the same file. So there is no difference that can be perceived by Google or any other search engine about the different content of every page. Are you okay to go forward? Cool. So, okay, now let's move into the interesting stuff. So all this effort just to get there, and we have the last half hour to do this, okay? So, this is one of the most interesting capabilities of React, in my opinion, and that's what enables us to do universal rendering and routing, which basically is, in React, we have this functionality that is coming from this package called render to string, which basically means that if we have a component like this one, which is our hello world that we did about 50 times today, we can do render to string this component. And if we run this script here in Node with this code here, then we will get this output. So we will get a piece of HTML code, right? I haven't seen that in any other framework before React. After React, even Angular and other frameworks started to integrate features like this. But we will see in a moment why this is cool. Let's say that we want to do this for our current application, right? So again, we have this little script called test server-side rendering that wants to render our application. Here there is a little detail that we need to take into account. So we import our application from the app file, okay? And then we need this time to use a different kind of router from the React router, called static router. And this is because when we do server-side rendering, we don't have a browser, right? So before we were using browsing router, but browser router only knows the URL coming from the history API of the browser. Here, since we are running this thing on the server in Node, we don't have even a browser, right? So what are we supposed to do? We can use this static router that doesn't know anything about the current route, but we can specify the route ourselves with this location, okay? So in this specific example, we are wrapping our application with a static router, and we are specifying the home location. Okay, we will see what context means later on, but we also need to specify a context object. And in this case, the resulting code, you don't need to really understand this. Believe me that this is the same HTML code that we have in the home page, okay? So you might start to think this thing here, right? We can create an express server where basically we map the current route to something that looks like this, where every time we change what's in here with the current URL, and then return it as a response to the HTTP layer. And this basically will make so that in the server, we actually know what's going on in the React application, and we can pre-render it for the browser. So in order to do this, we need to do a little changes in our application. Again, I'm going to explain you very quickly all the changes, and then you can do it yourself. And I will show you how it looks like if you're tired. So the first thing we need to change is that now the content of the HTML page from the server is not static anymore. It's not always the same index file. It's going to be a different HTML every time. So we can use a template for all the stuff that remains the same, like all these declarations here, title, meta stuff, reference to style sheet, and reference to our script, and so on. But this part here, which is the piece of React application, changes all the time. So we need to put a variable in here, and we can save this as an EJS template, okay? And we will save it into source views index.js. Now, we can create our Express application, and this is the core of the workshop today. So basically, this is a server in Express. How many of you have experience with Express? Oh, not so many, so maybe I should explain what Express is. Okay, so Express is basically, I don't know, if you have experience with PHP or any other framework, server-side framework, it's like the symphony of Node.js, okay? So it's a web framework to build web application on the server. So basically you can do things like, if I get this route, I don't know, if I get /home, I can serve you this content. So you can make queries to the database and create an HTML using a template and then return it as a response. And things like that. So it has lots of features, like you can integrate with other libraries, it can manage cookies and security, authorization, authentication, all the basic things that you have in every web framework. So Express is the most famous in Node.js land. The idea here is that we are using Express to use all the facilities to get the current request URL and to create an HTML response. But in reality, it's just a layer between the native Node libraries and the HTTP layer. Okay, so the first thing we do here is to import a bunch of libraries. The most important ones are HTTP server from HTTP and Express from Express. Then we import React. And then we import this method render to string that we just saw before, the static router, and our application. Okay, this is just all initialization code. Then we need to initialize an Express application, which looks a bit like this. So you create a new app instance, then you create a new server instance, and then you define, okay, I want to use the template engine called AJS, and all my templates are going to live in this folder called views. And finally, you are going to say, okay, every request that is going to match files that are in these folders, dist and static, I'm going to serve them directly because they don't need to be pre-calculated, but they are, I don't know, CSS, images, JavaScript files that we just want to return to the user. And then this part here is the actual business logic that we want to execute in the server. So app.get, it means that every time we are matching a get request, so me.get, that matches asterisk, which of course, guess what, matches every URL, because this logic works for every URL in our application. Then we can manage the request and return a response, okay? So our idea was that we can render the markup of our React application using the render to string method, and we can pass request.url, which is going to look exactly like / if we are in the index page, /athlete /id if we are in a specific page of an athlete, or something else if we are just trying a random URL. And then context for now is just an empty object. And again, we will see better later when this can be useful, but it's mandatory to specify an object. So right now I'm just creating an empty object, which doesn't look like anything meaningful, but trust me that we will need it later. And finally, we can use the response.render to specify the name of a template, and then we can pass parameters to that template. And remember that here we call this variable markup, and here we are passing the result of rendering our React application as markup. So what is going to happen is that render to string is going to render everything as in here, and all this code here is going to be embedded inside here. So at the end, you will get all this HTML code that decorates our specific React application. And finally, this is another step that is needed in Express to initialize the server that basically is telling, okay, I want to run this server in the port 3000. And when it's actually running, print a message that is telling me that everything was okay. So in order to make this work, we need to do some little changes. So we need to disable the static.index HTML, because otherwise it's going to be served every time by this thing here. So every time we just say slash, we will get the old index. And we don't want that anymore because we want to use a template. Then the second thing to do is to restore the original webpack file without hot module reload. That's, to be honest, not really needed, but it's going to cause issues unless you literally change this and make it more complex. So there are ways that you can have hot module reload on the server side as well, but I have to say it's not easy at all, so I just removed this part for now. And I'm going to give you at the end of the workshop links in case you want to do that as well. And finally, we need to run this command here, which is going to create a file that basically is what we are going to use for the front-end part of the application. Okay? So just to explain this better. So you see here that we are using this file bundle.js. So what is going to happen is that we get a request, HTTP request. This request is processed by the server. The server render our React application, wraps it into this file, and everything is returned to the browser. So at the end, the browser will already have HTML with meaningful content, but will not have any JavaScript action because it's just HTML at this stage. So all the JavaScript front-end code will live in this file. That is the same file that we are using to generate the server-side part. So this is the thing that is a bit crazy, right? Because we have two different components, server and front-end, and they use exactly or almost exactly the same code. It's just that they pick up different capabilities. So on the server, we will not react to any event because we don't even have the concept of clicking, but we still render the same components. But then when the same app is initialized in the front end by React, all the handlers like onClick and things like that are attached and the app becomes responsive. This is to me the magic of universal JavaScript. So after we do all of this, we are ready to test this thing again. So I told you that the first thing to do, I already deleted all the files that needed to be deleted. So I just need to generate the webpack file, the web packet file for the front end. And it's going to look like this. So basically, I'm just generating the bundle file. And then we can just run the server with node modules.bin. Okay, now you might wonder, why are we using Babel node and not node itself? This is because we are using JSX code in our server side. And of course, Node doesn't know anything about JSX. So if you try to run this with Node, it's going to fail because at some point there is going to be, I don't know, Angular bracket up, and it's not valid JavaScript code. So Babel node instead transpiles the code into valid JavaScript code before executing it using the rules that we defined in our Babel file. Okay, so we are seeing this up again and again and again. Let's see if it works as we expected. So links seems to be working. We can go back, we can go in again, we can click in there. Now, the issue that we had before is that if I did inspect and then network, let me refresh. So this file here, this is the index. I think I'm opening the wrong file. because we should have seen here more content, unless it's Google caching stuff. Oh yeah, it was Google caching the request. So if we inspect, if we get the actual content right now, in the index page, it's going to contain the list of all the athletes. And then if we go back there, again, I'm going to refresh and open the page source. It's going to contain all the code. Okay, so now we are rendering also from the server. Now there is something that I want you to notice. So I told you that I'm not an athlete, right? And of course we are getting a 404. But the server is returning 200. So if Google will ever see this, they're going to start to think that I am a real content. So if somebody shares athlete Luciano, I am a real content, valid content, and the meaning of this content is 404 page not found. So you might search online for 404 page not found and end up in this page, just because somebody shared this URL. This is not good, because of course we want to have here a 404. So let's add this part as well. So this is basically the issue again. I'm going to a URL that is supposed to be 404, but I'm getting there 200, which bad juju for SEO. Okay, how do we fix this? And finally, we get to use this thing called context, right? You remember I told you before that there was an object called context that was needed, but we were really doing nothing with it because it was an empty object. Okay, now let me explain what context really is. So context is an object that you have only when you are in the static router. And this object is passed through all the components that gets rendered with the static router. And specifically, you will get this object only if you are implementing the class way of creating components. In this step, component will mount. You will have static context in the props, okay? And this static context, it's something that you can use and add stuff to it, like notice that you want to give to the server, or I don't know, metadata that you want to share with other components only in the server-side rendering. So here, basically what I'm doing, I'm changing the 404 component we had before, and I am taking advantage of this context to say, every time that this component is rendered, I want to say in the context, is 404 equal true? So that somebody later on can check if this value is 404 is true or false, and maybe do things with it. Notice that I have to do an if statement here, because this thing here is not going to be available in our client part of the application. So if here you do complex stuff, this is going to fail because you might reference undefined things, okay? So it's very important that you do this if there in order to be sure that you are rendering this thing on the server side and that you have the static context. So once we do that, in our Express application, we can do this thing. So we define by default the status to be 200, but then after we render all of this, in case we are also rendering the 404 page in this specific request, we will have this value is 404 to true, because the component will set the value in the context, right? And so we can say, so if context is 404, then the current status is going to be 404, and then we can respond with the proper status. Okay? So if we test it again, I can show it to you in a moment, but now we should see something like this. Okay? Okay, now again, I'm going to go to something invalid. And now I finally see 404. Okay, so now finally we have a website that is optimized for search engines. And that's almost the end of it. So there is another part that, to be honest, I don't want to explain it to you because it's just boring configuration stuff. I don't think there is much value in it. But I also, anyway, I added slides in case you want to do this at home, in case you really are building a real application where you want to integrate universal routing, you will need to take care of this step. But it's something that is literally copy-pasting configuration from one place to another. So the only thing left to do is just to recap everything that we did, which is, okay, I hope understood what universal JavaScript means. And then we created an app with it. And we also learned a bit of React and React Router. And finally, we used all these learnings to build our application and make it universal. So in the first step, we just created a front-end only application. In the second step, we added all the universal routing and rendering part. Of course, this is just the surface of universal JavaScript because we didn't do anything complex. We are not even making HTTP request to an API, which makes things way more complicated. So you can see this workshop just as the first step, but if you will really need to do this in a real application, you will need to learn a bunch of other concepts. And I left you some links in there. Of course, in the book, there is a full chapter in the book I showed at the beginning that explains how to do more advanced things. And then you can use other tools like Create React App, Universal Create React App, that are just tools that allow you to create a new app from scratch with all the configuration already done for you. And you might ask, why then you did us copy all these things all the time? Did you ask yourself? So if there was a tool that could do everything for us, why are we doing everything manually? And that's a good question because and I have a response which is, okay, you can do things with this thing, but then you don't know what's happening behind the scenes. Now that you did everything yourself, you know what is happening, and if you need to change some configuration, you should know more or less what to change. So I think it's better to learn how it works and then to use the tools that simplify your job. Then another interesting thing is how to do progressive web apps with React. And it turns out that you can do progressive web apps that are also universal. And then how to integrate React and Redux together in a boilerplate that also uses auth module reload on the server. Finally, if you want to check the complete code of this example, there is a repository. If you want to give it a star, I will take it as a thank you. And that's it. So we still have time anyway. So if you want to go back and check something else, we can do other exercise or review other pieces of code. Or if you just want to take this time to do, I don't know, question answers, we can do that. Question there.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting talk. Just one question. If you would run this in production, you would obviously do a lot of processing on server side. So do you have any experience setting up some kind of caching for the server side rendered things?
Okay, very interesting question. So I have to say that there is no, let's say, generic rule, because, you know, when it gets to caching, there is so many things that you have to take into account. But in reality, it's not indifferent than any other server-side application. What would you do, for example, with a PHP application? I don't know, let's say it's a WordPress website, right? Most of the time you can render the page in WordPress once, and if somebody's never changing the content of that page, you can literally cache that HTML file and then use some tool to render that. And here is not indifferent as well. Like, if you know that your content is not going to change, you can use tools like Varnish or things like that to hold the cache. Or if you want to do the cache yourself in the Express application, you can use, I don't know, Redis or Memcache. And then instead of going through the React phase, you will just check in the cache directory or database or whatever you are going to use for the cache first. So my proposal will be just to keep it simple. First, to use a file-based cache, but that's only if your rendering is very heavy. So if you have very complex React application, so you can store the files So the resulting render to string output into a file. And then every time you check, okay, do I have this file already? Yes, return it. No, render to string. And then save the cache. Then the next step will be, okay, file system is not very fast, so I can use Redis or Memcache. And then the next step as well, okay, the connection with Redis and Memcache is not super fast, so I'm going to use Varnish or something like that. Does it respond to your question? Okay, cool. Any other question? If you are happy with this, we can also finish a bit early. So you can have an extra coffee. But also, you can feel free to stay and make other questions after, okay? So I don't want to hold you anymore to copy and paste code because I think it doesn't make much sense. But if there is something you want to do in these last 10 minutes, feel free to ask. Okay, I think it's okay. They will add you.
I noticed that you used EJS template, but you could do all the templating in JSX except for maybe doctype HTML. I recently made a server-side rendering project and manually set up the project where I had JSX as template, and I only enhanced it with a small string doctype HTML and in the beginning.
That's a very good question as well. So just to clarify the question, I'm gonna go back here, I think. Yeah, here. So the question is basically why I'm using two different template engines, because at the end, if you look into React, it's nothing else than a glorified template engine, right? So why are we using here on the server side both AJS with which its own template engine, and then using another template engine which is React, and combine the two things together? And it's a very good question, and that's mostly because I did want to share in an easy way the code from the client and the server. And of course, in the client, you will need to have something that creates the basic structure of the application. So you will need to have something like this outside your React application. You can reduce it a little bit, like maybe you can have just HTML and script. So I have seen people, and this is particularly important when you want to manage from React also all the meta tags here, which is something that is going to be interesting in case you want to really optimize for search engines. For example, you will have here, I don't know, a description, meta tags and stuff like that. And every time you change the route, they need to change accordingly, right? So it's not a stupid idea, of course, to do what you just did, which is try to keep this file as small as possible. It can even be a string, and then you concatenate stuff. You don't need to have the feature of a full template engine. But in my case, I just wanted to keep it simple, and that's why I prefer to use it this way. And I think it's just easier to explain. But it's true that in real project, it's probably going to be a good idea to manage also all this part in React. So our React application probably is going to start from the HTML layer. So we will have a component that will render HTML and everything else, instead of layout component, which is going to be just here. Any other question? Thank you for the question anyway. Cool. I think you are free to go. I just forgot to tell you that, of course, if you have any feedback, I will really, really, really appreciate, because I think that this workshop is really far from being perfect, really, really far. And I would like to do it again in other events. So any feedback will be super helpful for me to improve this. Also, feel free to connect on Twitter, GitHub, and everything else. You have the links in the first slide, and the second slide, actually. So feel free even to ask me stuff, I don't know, tomorrow or next week. If you are going to go through the slides again and you have questions, feel free to do it. Thank you again, everybody, for coming.